Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar titled EU and US Energy Partnership, What's Next After the US Election? Today we'll explore how the recent US election will impact the transatlantic energy relationship and the broader global energy transition. The shifts in US leadership under Donald Trump will mark a departure from decades of multilateral cooperation. Europe, and especially Germany, must now adapt to a more transactional, deal-oriented approach to diplomacy. However, as we assess Germany's role in navigating this new reality, it's important to reflect also its current internal political instability. The breakup of the German government on the very day of Trump's election sent a signal of disarray to the world and has limited the nation's ability to act decisively on the global stage. Today we are privileged to have two distinguished speakers with us who will offer their expert insights on these topics. To our right, we have Professor Abdelal, who is the Joseph C. Wilson Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School and a leading authority on international political economy. His research focuses on the intersection of geopolitics, energy markets, and global economic systems. He has authored influential works in the geopolitics area, focusing on energy security in Europe and also its global connections regarding the economy of global finance. Beyond academia, Professor Abdelal advises governments and corporations on energy diplomacy and has contributed extensively to discussions on how energy markets shape global power dynamics. And to my left is Friedbert Pflüger. He is a former State Secretary to the German Federal Ministry of Defense and a former member of the Bundestag. He is currently, full disclosure, our chairman of the supervisory board at Zukunft Gas and managing director of Pflüger International. And he is also a partner of a foundation, a think tank called Clean Energy Forum, focusing on advancing sustainable energy solutions. And with decades of experience in European and global energy policy, he is a leading advocate for pragmatic climate policy. His insights, recently also published in a book, bridge the gap between politics and business in the energy sector. And my name is Tim Kehler. I'm CEO and President of Zukunft Gas. To kick off, I'll invite each of our speakers to share their opening thoughts on the current state of transatlantic energy relations, if there are any, and what lies ahead of us after the US election. Ravi, please.
So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you in Berlin and to see you again, to meet you. If you will indulge me, I'd like to open brief remarks with a quote from George Washington, the first president of the United States. This was some years after the revolution had taken place, the country was new, and he wrote to a friend, "I am mortified beyond expression." Mortified, this is translatable easily into German, surely. Embarrassed, mortified beyond expression that in the moment of our acknowledged independence, we should, by our conduct, verify the predictions of our transatlantic foe, meaning the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and render ourselves ridiculous and contemptible in the eyes of all Europe. I have to admit, as we begin this conversation, that this is a feeling that I have about the United States, mortified beyond expression about what we have delivered yet again to the world. Two brief reflections, and you alluded to this already. Is there, in fact, an energy partnership between the European Union and the United States? A partnership implies mutual commitment. A partnership implies a relationship that lasts beyond the transaction. And so I think for me, one of the questions is, can such a thing be cultivated if it does not exist? And I think perhaps it does not yet, as a partnership, as a relationship. And I have a lot of reflections on the US election. It probably will not surprise you that I was disappointed by the outcome. I voted for Vice President Harris. But there's something more fundamental that we have to consider, which is that this is not an accident, this election. It is possible when we look back at the 2016 election of President Trump. And the excuses for the left in the United States were all over the place. It was the Russians who provided disinformation. It was a protest vote. It was because Secretary Clinton represented the establishment too fully. It was because Secretary Clinton didn't visit the Midwest of the United States. It was just because of the Electoral College. And President Trump never could achieve a majority of the popular vote. It was only going to be 47%. I think we have to let go of those excuses and recognize this election for what it is. This is a shift away from transatlanticism as a grand strategy, away from partnership as grand strategy, and recognize the fact that President Trump won a majority of the popular vote, which is, this is what the people want. This is who the United States is right now. And so we sometimes get caught up in President Trump as this idiosyncratic political figure, as though he's just random, but he's not. He is representing more than half of Americans right now. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner we can make sense of how to adjust not just the transatlantic relationship, but also every geopolitical, energy, and diplomatic and economic relationship in the world around this new fact. This is who we are. Sorry, but that's our reality.
But if you boil this popular vote down to the question, what do the American voters really want? What's driving them to take this popular vote?
So the details are fascinating, and we probably don't have time to get into all of them. I think there are three fundamental issues. One is that the American voters voted on the economy more than anything else, and on the border more than anything else. Those two were their issues. And so the left in the United States presented this election as democracy on the ballot. If you love democracy, you cannot possibly vote for President Trump. That did not land with the American people. That is not how they saw the election. And the left had not been seen for a long time as being strong on border issues, which are not, by the way, unreasonable to consider that the borders of countries should be sound. But the left had not made credibly the claim that they took seriously border policy. But I think more fundamentally, and this is not just about the United States, this is also true in Europe, the fact that the left seemed to have abandoned the working class in favor of other kinds of politics, including various identitarian politics, but not the politics of class, meant that the working class in the United States has shifted rightward, possibly permanently, though we will see. I think this is a reckoning for the left in the United States to ask itself whether a new embrace of class as a relevant category of politics, the economics of the labor market, the economics of how the American system functions. So the positive side, and maybe we'll talk more about this, is that this reckoning was long overdue for the left in the United States, and I think in many countries in Europe. The idea that the left has lost the working class to the right, in historical perspective, is deeply, deeply puzzling. So I think that's the fundamental shift.
Before we come to Friedbert's view, let me ask another question on the decision-making rationale of the voters. So what role did external relations play? What role did energy policies play? And for the German public, of course, also of very high importance, which role did climate policies play?
Oh, so you're just inviting me to be depressing. And I'm sorry, it's not my fault. But for the United States, this represents the end of the climate agenda for the foreseeable future. And this belief, mistaken, to be sure, that the climate agenda is driven by some collection of global cosmopolitan, mostly European political and business elites who don't understand the needs of the everyday working class citizen to have affordable milk and affordable cereal and affordable energy prices, that this is some fantasy of our European friends as opposed to like a deep fundamental structural need of the planet. That, I think, represents a rejection of this idea that the climate crisis is urgent. I think the vote represents a view of the majority of American citizens that the climate crisis is not, in fact, urgent, which we all know is not true. It is desperately urgent. But that's more than half of Americans who feel that way. And so I think in that sense, it reflects a rejection of transatlanticism, but also a rejection of this idea that our green friends in Europe who are so worried about all of this, like what are they even doing? Like if we have gas that we can frack, we should use it. If we have coal around, we should use that too. Like that there's a precious Europeanness that we're rejecting. I think that is part of the feel. And I just want to be clear, this is not my view. We're
trying to explore the views of the voters.
Exactly.
Right, they have explained that this is the majority at the end. Friedbert, you have published an article on your view on Trump's election yesterday. It was titled, "This is a massive disruption." What are your views? Why is it so?
Well, first, it's great to have you, and I share almost everything you said. It is a disruption. The enormous basic consensus that we had throughout post-war history in the United States when it comes to foreign affairs, transatlantic relationship is a basis for that, is not valid anymore. But also internally, there is a Trump revolution. It's the end of continuity. And he says that, and he's proud of that. And what I think was the most important thing I got out from your first sentences here, Ravi, was that you said that's what the American people believe. So it is not an error. It is not because they were stupid. It is the democratic vote of the Americans, and they wanted something different. It's a reaction to a weak presidency.
Sure.
I think we could say that also. And it is economy, migration, and climate. And here I differ a little bit. Of course, it is clear that Donald Trump does not believe that climate issues are on the forefront of his agenda. And he will cancel Paris Accord. But if we look back even to the recent history of the United States, Kyoto Agreement, there has always been quite a consensus in the United States that they do not want to be led by the international community when it comes to energy issues. So here I would say it is probably more coming back to normal in the United States than that he is exceptionally breaking with a course that has been there all the time. Second point, I agree that he will not go along with these, ever more ambitious aims. But when it comes to climate technology, when it comes to, the possibility that we know that wind and solar energy are business cases, meanwhile. In Texas, I've been to Texas recently, and you see fracking, drilling, you see LNG ports, but you see a revolution also when it comes to renewables. So both go hand in hand. And if you go a little bit outward of Houston, you see a drilling well, and you see right next to it, a windmill. So I think that will be the reality of the United States, both next to each other, and business will decide what is the best. So that is not, in my point of view, a complete no to climate technology. It is a clear yes to business. And that brings me to one question, and what is with the IRA? The IRA is probably the best that Mr. Biden has achieved. Will that stay? I understand that many Republican governors believe that the IRA was helpful because it incentivizes with tax cuts climate technologies, CCS, synthetic methane, e-fuels, hydrogen, and everything. So if we could keep the IRA, if not the label, but the substance, well, perhaps we could be a little bit more optimistic. And last point, I understand that in the United States, it is very much the states who are, in charge of climate policy. So if you see California, for instance, and other states, you see that they are embarking on a different course and will keep that course with climate technology. So I believe that here Trump will not be able to make everything back to where it was before the Paris Agreement. So here in the climate field, I'm a little bit more optimistic, not because he likes all these Paris agreements, but because of the necessity of bringing new business cases, and here climate technologies have advanced in the last years.
Could I share a reflection?
Sure. I'd like to delve there deeper, actually, particularly also on the question of IRA. But maybe we should focus a little bit also on those subnational actors in the U.S., like the states, cities, corporations, which certainly play a very important role in the dynamics of changing the landscape and advancing climate initiatives. We've seen. You mentioned Texas, you mentioned California. We've seen large startups like Tesla being created based on the idea of carbon-free mobility as one example. So is the power of the American economy stronger than any regulation that might come or might not come? How strongly is something like IRA needed at all?
I think these are great questions. And I'm sorry I appear so grumpy before you since I'm just recovering from this election. But let us stick on the question of optimism, because I share this optimism. It's a different kind of optimism, and I love the way you put it. Before we get to that, thinking about this rupture in transatlanticism, there's a way in which it could be said that this is a return to normal for the United States. Since the founding of the country, the United States was isolationist and unilateral, including to the detriment of the world and to Europe. Until very late in the First World War was there a real engagement, and then a retreat again to isolationism. So the curious moment was the post-World War II years, when there was always a balance between unilateralism and multilateralism, always a balance between isolationism and engagement and transatlanticism. That was unusual in US history. And so this is a rupture with an unusual moment, and in a way, a return to more what the country was for almost all of its history. I would prefer for the climate agenda to be embraced by the federal government as a policy practice, as a grand strategy. This is not likely. And I think not likely for the foreseeable future. This goes back to how we think about the next 4 years. What's clear to me is that this is not, we wait 4 years more and then President Trump leaves and then the United States becomes transatlanticist again. This is not a realistic plan. This is a long-term, or at least medium-term reality with which we have to reckon. But the transactionalism has potential. If there's money to be made by American companies in partnership with whomever or on their own, we will pursue that. And so we could accidentally, from a business perspective, pursue climate goals, not because they are climate goals, but because they're financial goals. And so there's a real promise there.
We saw that with the shale revolution.
Yes.
So we had in 2010, 11, this enormous fracking offensive in the United States. And the shale revolution was, of course, criticized by environmentalists, but by and large, it substituted coal in the United States.
Absolutely.
So US was not part of Kyoto. It did not comply to any huge and important climate goals of the international community, but it substituted coal by shale gas and had more impact to minimize emissions than all our highly subsidized systems that we ran in Europe. So a similar thing might happen.
Absolutely.
And look to a man whom he has invited to become his interior minister. That is Doug Burgum from North Dakota. He's the governor of North Dakota, and he has promised to make North Dakota by 2030 climate neutral with new technologies. And North Dakota, we should say, it is an oil and gas state also. But he had that claim, and he is now interior minister. I look to Chris White, his energy minister, to his agenda. Well, he says very bluntly, I don't believe climate change is the greatest challenge to mankind. There are others, atomic war, for instance, or artificial intelligence. Will that lead to a stronger? Will it overcome mankind? So he doesn't believe that, but he never said it's not a problem.
Sure.
And he also never came out against renewables. He says it's a technological race. So we should be very careful in. Again, I wished he would have complied to Paris. Sure. And I don't want to be misunderstood. But I believe there are chances, and we should not panic. That's not the right thing. We should try to engage perhaps with the states, perhaps with communities, with certain members of his administration, perhaps also with himself when it comes to clear business cases. Yes. And we will have business cases with climate.
Ravi, before we continue, ladies and gentlemen, we're doing, of course, a webinar here, which is supposed to be interactive. So if you want to share your views or also questions to our experts with us, please use, of course, the chat or raise your hand. We are happy to incorporate your views into our discussion. So, Ravi, sorry.
I just wanted to come back to your observation, and this is related to the North Dakota comment. You raised this question, which I didn't address directly, but I think is really important, which is the subnational level in the United States, which could also be said in some ways about the European Union, because state sovereignty on these issues is still an important part of how these questions unfold here in Europe. So just to take Texas, since Texas came up. So Texas is about 1.5% of world's GDP, which is roughly the size of the economy of Spain, which is also, by the way, roughly the size of the economy of Russia, 1.5% of world GDP. Okay. So that's like talking about a kind of national policy of great significance. Now, I don't remember California relative to some European country, but the economy of California is larger than the economy of Texas. So let's call it France or Germany. Yep. Indeed. Yep. And so when we think about some of these large states, these are like countries in terms of their policies and how much impact they can have. And the other principle related to that is that the federal government of the United States has more or less, well, the incoming administration has more or less said, we're not doing this at the federal level. but we don't care what you do at the national level. This is also true, by the way, more or less with women's reproductive rights in the United States, which is it's not a national level question anymore. It's a state level question. So the voters of particular states can have very different views from the entire country's voters. And then we should also consider mayors, city leaders, who are on the front lines of this, thinking about how climate change affects their citizens. And one of the beautiful things about mayors of cities is that they're not really left-right. Those distinctions are not as critical in their politics because they are where the lives of citizens meet government. And they have their own views about how to manage these things at the city level, and those matter a lot. So I'm feeling a lot better already thinking about it.
Let's explore some other areas of potential. After the Russian invasion to Ukraine and the stop of Russian gas flows to Germany, the US has stepped in and secured the supply of gas. And by this, more or less accidentally, or we stumbled into a very deep economic relationship. Europe is the most important destination of US LNG, and vice versa. US is the most important importer or exporter to Europe. So there is already some kind of relationship. Yes, we need to explore whether this is a stable bridge, but Friedbert, now looking at our situation here in Germany, we are facing snap elections very soon. We might see a change in government. What would be your recommendation to the new leaders in Germany? How to build up on this existing relationship that is already there, based on LNG? We have developed quite a bit of import capacity. Is this maybe already an asset in these kind of discussions?
Well, it is, and it is a point where Donald Trump will certainly not be against LNG export, not even against stepping them up. I have a certain fear that he might use that as a political weapon one day. If we don't do what he wants, he could say, well, I stop it or I cut it.
Europe is used to this, though.
What has always said against the Russians could also become true now. But so far, I think that most people believe that he will step LNG up, and probably to an extent that we have to be very careful that we do not run from one dependency to another dependency. I think we all learned the lesson that we should never be too dependent on one side, that we should diversify. And in the moment when it comes to LNG, the US is on the way to, at least not in that strength now, but it's on the way to become a very, very important player. By the way, the one who interrupted this flow of LNG was Mr. Biden with his moratorium in I think in January this year. And he has put in moratorium to new gas cooperation with Europe. And here I think the first sign of the Trump administration will be to get rid of that moratorium.
For sure.
So when it comes to LNG, I think that really is, as you quite rightly indicated, a possibility where we could build on with the new administration.
On the other side, Ravi, this also could be, there could be some kind of backfire in this discussion, that we see some kind of America first. We have a question on this in the chat discussion that, I mean, we already heard some kind of resonances in the debate recently that limiting exports might also bring down prices in the US. So this is a risk to this kind of early foundation that we see in such a partnership.
I think these are great questions. And I will also note, one of our friends in the chat pointed out that California would be the 5th largest economy in the world. So thank you to our friends for doing the research that we needed for that little question.
Swarm intelligence of our webinar here. That's good.
So that's very helpful. This is not a polite thing to say, but I think that this administration would love to be the Qatar of the Americas. Mm-hmm. This administration faces a question which the United States has faced ever since the fracking revolution, which is whether to more or less trap all of this gas on a little gas island, the United States, and use low energy prices to reindustrialize, or to use this opportunity to become a major player in LNG markets. My intuition, based in part on what incoming administration officials have expressed and what President Trump has himself expressed, is that export is the priority over trapping the gas and reindustrializing with low energy prices. So I could be wrong. I'm wrong about things all the time. But that is the direction it looks more likely to take, which is we're going to liquefy and export. And then it gets to this question of partnership, which is it a partnership if you just buy whatever we sell? Or is that a commercial relationship?
You mentioned Qatar. Their business model is based on destination clauses, on long-term contracts. We see with the US suppliers more free on board, much more short-term projects. Is there an appetite for these kind of business models that the Qataris are applying?
I think absolutely yes, because they make sense. And this we've learned from the natural gas relationships that emerged, especially with piped gas over the last 60 or 70 years, which is that there is a great benefit to suppliers to know that there is a customer who will buy it at a price that is reasonably well understood for a long period of time. And that is a relationship and not just a commercial arrangement.
We're experiencing over here some kind of reluctance towards long-term commitments, long-term contracts. What could be changed so that these kind of possibilities are being explored?
Well, here the message that we send is we basically do not want really gas, at least not for a longer time. So in the moment you say you will phase out in the mid-30s or late 30s, you send the signal to the Americans, better not embark on a policy of long-term gas contracts, which means the gas will be more expensive because then it is much more spot market oriented. And that's a question to the European lawmakers, also to the German lawmakers. Are we that rigid? Do we put our very ambitious aims of phasing out gas, do we take that more serious than, the necessity to get affordable energy in Europe to keep our country competitive? And we have to rebalance that, perhaps to a certain extent, with the new government. My personal belief is that it is right to phase out, but it is not right to be too rigid here. First, we need enough and affordable hydrogen on the market, which can substitute that. And as it seems right now, that will not come in time. So we should not say we get rid of gas at a certain moment if we do not know what will replace it. And therefore, I believe we have a lot of chances to discuss with our American partners to make a framework where we have a partnership, as you said, and not only a business relationship.
And I would maybe just add one thought to that. And I realize the subtle irony, perhaps, though I have written this down in print, in public. So I'm not just saying this because here we are at Zukunft Gas, but gas is essential for whatever comes next. Like, we cannot do without it as a transition fuel, and the transition might take longer than we imagine. And compared to the alternatives, it's critical. But what's, I think, even more critical is the timing of all of it. And this, I totally agree, which is that what we risk in Europe is deindustrialization because the transition has unfolded too quickly. with goals that are perhaps too rigid for the use of transition fuels like gas. And once deindustrialization has unfolded, it is very, very difficult to renew it. And so what that means is, will Europe become a lovely open-air museum with not enough industry to employ all of the people who need dignified, meaningful employment? Or will Europe find a way to remain competitive and continue to be an important part of the industrial landscape of the world?
On this note, we have a couple of questions which are quite specific, but I'm trying to frame them a little bit more generic. The whole discussion is actually based on what you mentioned, that we replace coal by gas, that we reduce the CO2 emissions of power plants. However, this is only true if we stick to certain environmental standards. So if methane emissions are being controlled, the Norwegians show that they can take it down to close to zero. So this is a prerequisite for all these arguments. And of course, we need to have stability in the development that green fuels also are being produced and shipped to the US. So linked to these observations, do you think there will be some kind of rollback of environmental standards in gas production in the US? Over here, if you look into public media and state TV, sometimes natural gas from the US is framed as, well, something from a third world country. So is that the route you're taking?
Oh. Well, I think, so let's try to stay optimistic for a moment. Is it likely, framed as a rhetorical question, that there will be federal rollbacks of programs to make the gas industry greener in the United States? Almost certainly, yes. But then we return to the question of state-level governance. And there, I think it is much less certain, which again is...
Even in those states where there's strong dependency on oil and gas production?
Well, the North Dakota example is one.
Okay, yeah.
And I think there's a lot to be learned about how a state like Texas will address these questions. And maybe not at all. Maybe without federal compliance obligations, Texas will revert to the lowest possible common denominator. And then if that's true, which I think is still an open question, but if that's true, then it would be right to regard the United States as an LNG exporter, as one that does not take seriously its own emissions challenges from the industry. But I do think it's an open question.
Well, I would say, when I was in Texas, I addressed the question of methane emissions, which of course is very important. And the answer I got is that the companies themselves do everything they can to reduce them. And there are laws, meanwhile, which clearly make it much more difficult to emit methane. So we should encourage everyone, because LNG will not be welcome here if there is not a regime on methane. And I think this is a business case again. So we always should look to business cases. That's also my point when it comes to green gases. I mean, to make more green molecules. What is different in the United States from here is it will not be subsidized. But if you produce green molecules as a business case, it will be very welcome. And we see that China, and I'm sure Mr. Trump sees that as well, has embarked on climate technology. It is a race who is the best in climate technologies. So I could imagine that from here, from another angle, not from the regulatory angle, not from the state putting more and more higher aims out. But from the technological and economic side, there could be a difference in climate issues.
But you just came in from Baku, literally. Looking at how the other blocs in the world and also other industrial or non-industrial countries are positioned themselves, what kind of global development do you see in this respect?
Well, I think that fits a little bit to what I just said. In Baku, of course, you have these climate diplomats and politicians who say every day the world is in a terrible situation, we have to do more, and that they come out with more and more aims. But large parts of the world do not accept that anymore. For instance, now we have this financial questions. How much do countries from the West, from the industrialized nations, finance for others? And there is a reluctance to do that because climate issues have not anymore the importance than they used to have. So the COP that I saw in Baku has, and also in Dubai already a year ago, is more and more the development into a sort of fair for climate technologies and for a meeting place of businesses who make big deals on a huge solar power plant or a huge wind park in the Caspian Sea or a power line from Baku to Romania and things like that. So that is the core of climate policy. It's less the politicians saying you have to do this and this, but it's technology and engineers. And here could even come a positive sign from the United States.
And maybe I would just share one other thought about what we could call the business case, and perhaps also think about it as the managerial case and not just the business commercial case, which is to say, there's a way in which the United States as a society is one generation behind Europe in terms of how it considers these questions of the climate agenda. Maybe almost exactly one generation behind Europe. Young Americans do not have doubt about these questions. So the consensus in Europe among people our age does not exist in the United States among people our age, but it does exist among the younger generation, maybe several generations below. And a managerial question for these companies is, can they attract talent? If the talent, who is young, knows that the policies of the company, the strategic decisions of the company, do not accord with their political beliefs, and they are deeply committed to these political beliefs. The answer is basically no. You cannot run a company in the United States and attract young talent of any kind without taking these questions seriously. Very important. Which is not a commercial question in the sense of like per se making money.
There is a silver lining of...
The silver lining, again, we're looking for silver linings here.
Okay, perfect.
The young will...
That's very much
absolutely
what I said.
Exactly,
And I fully believe in your point with a basic consensus. That's not there in the United States. That is polarized, even also in climate issues. And here we have a strong basic consensus that climate policies will remain on the agenda. So even if we have a new government here, it will not be a break. It will not be a disruption. It will be continuity with some major corrections. And that is the big difference, I think, between our two countries.
How can we expand on the silver lining? I mean, if you say that it's a matter of time until this perception is evolving, but it's irreversible development. How can we as Europeans, as Germans, influence or accelerate this development? We're trying to be front runners, we're trying to be good examples, obviously not in all cases. So what would be a recommendation to accelerate this development?
This is probably not helpful advice. I think you will just have to be patient with us.
Okay.
And well-meaning efforts to accelerate this generational transition in the United States might even be counterproductive, which is like, oh, and then the German, environmentalists are telling us what to do. But I can tell you this. So I've been a professor at Harvard Business School for 25 years. And when I first arrived and we talked about these issues with the MBA students who are like 27, 28 years old, more or less we could not teach about this issue because a majority of students in 1999 would say, this is made up. Like, this is not for real. We don't believe this. We'll leave aside for the moment whether believing in science is like a reasonable epistemological stance. But that is completely gone. So 25 years later, I will have 0 students among the 27-year-old MBA students, 0, who dispute the importance of this question. This is a Harvard Business School. Okay. Right, the West Point of capitalism in the United States. And even those students who are a little skeptical, they won't say it out loud among their peers because they know that the consensus is so robust that if they say out loud, like, oh, it's all bullshit or whatever, that they will be ridiculed and shunned for taking this anti-science position. So if we think about it in those terms, maybe the answer is just let us make our way. Let these 27-year-olds and 28-year-olds make their way into corporate America. And they will do the right thing when they take these leadership roles.
The climate movement here would say, well, then it is too late.
I understand. And we're looking for silver linings.
And therefore, there is more rush necessary. But as you said, you cannot say from top, we have to do this and this. You have to win the hearts of the people. You have to win acceptance for your course. And I think the acceptance we only get if we give more freedom to engineers, to technological solutions. That will be the core of finding a solution against Earth warming.
I'd like to shift the focus a little bit into another corner of the world, China. That has been obviously also an important aspect in the elections. The positioning of the US versus China will play an important role for the next administration. China is the biggest CO2 emitter. Do you see any repercussions here? Will there be any kind of motivation to China to change their path, to accelerate the path, or is it more signal to China being the biggest polluter? We don't have to move that quickly.
I can offer a couple of reflections on this. There's still the question, and Friedbert, you make a really good point, this sense that if we wait for this next generation in the United States or wait for the Chinese leadership to come around to taking these questions seriously, it could well be past a tipping point that cannot be revisited. And I recognize this concern. I will say my sense of China, the leadership in Beijing, let's say, is that their approach to these questions is being driven again by domestic political concerns. This feeling that the citizenry of China cares about the livability and breathability of the air of China, which is pushing not because China, as the Chinese government, cares as deeply as European governments do now, but they do face their own domestic legitimacy constraints on these issues, which is a different way of getting to the right answer. China faces its own, we don't have time to delve into all of the challenges China faces. It's the largest emitter of carbon, but not per capita. Right, so the Chinese government's
surpassed Germany.
Yes, exactly. The Chinese government always says, like, look, when we reach you in per capita emissions, then you can start lecturing us. Though, again, the too late question emerges in that. But China has the most rapidly aging society in the history of the planet Earth. its demographic challenges are deeply profound, and it faces all sorts of crises around labor markets and its industry based on the aging of the population. If we combine that with its needs to legitimate itself, the Chinese government, in the eyes of Chinese citizens on questions of not per se climate, but certainly on carbon and certainly on the livability of the country, and the likelihood that the United States, extremely high likelihood that the United States will impose significant tariffs on China, and not just on China, but certainly inclusively on China. Well, this is a radical thing to say, but the profound disruption of the global trading system that could result, which would be bad for living standards, bad for world GDP growth, but probably actually good for climate.
Okay, why so?
A faster growing world is a more carbon emitting world. A world in which industrial goods are shipped across the seas for minute percentages of return is a more carbon emitting world. And this has been a long conversation among some circles that perhaps the obsession with growth, output growth, has come at the expense of the climate. And shifting to a mindset that is more focused on the sustainability of employment rather than increases in GDP is a sort of steady state way to achieve both the dignity and meaning of employment and the inhabitability of the earth. So again, I guess looking for silver linings again.
It's very philosophical, and one can say many things to that. But a message which I got from COP was, please do not lecture us anymore, you Germans. I think most people understand the importance of climate. Also, at least your young generation in the United States. But most people around the world believe it's important, but they want to go their own way. So this front-runner Germany, model Germany, people are fed up with that message. So we should, not try to teach others what to do. And of course, we could have a lot of critical questions towards the Chinese. Of course, they embark on renewables more than anybody else, but they still have commissioned over 100 gigawatt coal in the last 2 years. So it's a very mixed picture. But we here in Europe still have, after billions of euro, which we put into as subsidies into renewables, growth of renewables, we still have in the energy system almost 80% fossil fuels. So we have not good results enough to crusade others on our way. We are not very good. We have not come very far. So if I were a Trump administration official in the Ministry of Energy, and someone from the German Greens would come and tell me what to do, I would tell him, well, what have you achieved? And that's not very, it's not great what we have achieved with all our rhetoric and with all our huge aims.
So maybe what could be said, just a brief and mostly humorous comment, if you Germans need to get it out of your system, your lecture, just give me the lecture. I'd be happy to listen, but leave the administration in the United States alone. I know you need to get out of your system, so just tell me.
I want to jump in for our final lap. You're lecturing to the future elite of business leaders. You are consulting to leading energy companies here in Europe. We had a discussion with some depressing moments. We were seeing some silver linings. You said we need some patience in the future development. And there was, to me, a very interesting takeaway also that at this subnational level, also the role of corporations and individual economic leaders might become more important rather than the big administrative systems that we're focusing. So the final question, closing question to you, teaching to the future elite and you consulting industrial leaders. What would your main recommendation for the next 2-3 years to those in responsibility in the industry, not in politics?
Shall I start? So I'll offer one reflection, and this is, again, after having spent many years, not just with 27-year-old MBA students, but also with executives who come through our programs, is that it does not take long anymore for aspiring business leaders or business leaders to ask themselves questions about their legacies and what they leave behind, which is not just money. And in this shifting social environment on these questions, including climate, but also sustainability of various kinds, not just environmental, the thing that is clearest to me is, even at age 30, definitely at 40, absolutely at 50, and for sure at 60, the leaders of commercial organizations begin to ask themselves questions. And the questions get harder the older they get, which is, what will I tell my children about what I did in this critical moment? What will I tell my grandchildren about what I did? And the answer cannot be, it was like the stock options were great, and so here's your trust fund, because the kids won't accept that as the answer. So what I would say is, start thinking now about the legacy you want to leave and how you want your career to be narrated by the people who love you, by the people who respect you. And that can fundamentally reshape one's approach to the big business questions. So yes, sure, if you're running a business, you have to make some money. But there are other things that are critical to how one crafts that narrative of what one leaves behind.
I would say when you're young, you sometimes think if there is a new president and a new agenda, that's a big catastrophe, and you're fed up with it, or you're fearful and don't want to cooperate anymore. I remember when Reagan came, many people here thought this is the end of the world, this warmonger, this cowboy. And the first thing I would say is, don't panic. Life continues. Try to do exactly what Ravi said. Take climate issues serious and try to convince the United States government wherever you can that it should embark on consensual solutions. Not teach them, not from a moralizing point, but from the point of view that you say, well, if you want to win the future in business, you better should compete in the field of climate technology, because that, at the end of the day, that is the strength on that the United States is based on. Yeah. And if you get him here, look to future possibilities for business, I think then you have perhaps a little bit more optimistic view.
Thank you, Rawi Abdelal. Thank you, Friedbert Pflüger, for your very valuable insights and these little silver linings that we were discussing in this very disruptive environment. And thank you to our audience for staying with us over this very insightful 60 minutes, and also your comments and thoughts that you have shared. I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.